This is another story about my naughty little sister. We know that she can say some cross things and she can say some kind things, but this little story is called My Naughty Little Sister Learns to Talk. Once upon a time, when my sister and I were little children, we had a very nice next door neighbour called, can you remember what she was called? Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones hadn't any children of her own, but she was very fond of my sister and me. Mrs. Jones especially liked my sister, even when she was naughty. Even when she was a cross and noisy baby with a red screaming face, Mrs. Jones would be kind and smiley to her and say, "There's a ducky then," to her. And sometimes Mrs. Jones would be so kind and smiley that my bad little sister would forget to scream. She would stare at Mrs. Jones instead, and when Mrs. Jones said, poor little thing," to her, my sister would go all mousy and quiet for her. My naughty little sister liked Mrs. Jones. When my naughty little sister was a very little baby girl, she couldn't talk at all at first. She just made funny, blowy, bubbly noises. But one day, without telling anyone, and without anyone telling her to do it, she said, "Mum, Mum," to my mother. We were all surprised. We told her she was a very clever baby. And because we were so pleased, she said, "Mum, Mum," again and again. She said it and she said it and she said it until we got very used to it indeed. Then, one day, when my little sister was saying, "Mum, Mum," and playing with her piggy toes, she saw our father looking at her. So she said, "Dad, Dad," instead. Father was very excited, and so was Mother, because our funny baby was saying "Mum, Mum," and "Dad, Dad" as well. I was excited too, and so was dear Mrs. Jones. And because we were so excited, my sister went on and on saying "Dad, Dad, Dad," and "Mum, Mum, Mum," over and over again, until Father and Mother and I weren't a bit excited anymore. Only dear Mrs. Jones went on being especially pleased about it. She was a nice lady. So, one morning, when Mrs. Jones looked over the fence and saw my little baby sister in her pram, sucking her finger, she said, "Don't suck your finger, ducky. Say, 'Dad, Dad,' and 'Mum, Mum' for Mrs. Jones." And what do you think? My funny sister took her fingers out of her mouth and said, "Dones." She said it very loudly, "Dones," like that. And Mrs. Jones was so astonished that she dropped all of her basket of wet washing. "Dones, Dones, Dones," my sister said, because she couldn't quite say Jones. And Mrs. Jones was so pleased. She left all her wet washing on the path and ran in to find Mr. Jones to come in here. Mr. Jones, who had been hammering nails in the kitchen, came out with a hammer in his hand and a nail in his mouth, running as fast as he could to hear my sister say, "Jones." When she said it to him too, Mr. Jones said my sister was a little knockout, which meant that she was very clever indeed. After that, my sister became their very special friend. Look, there she is. There's Mrs. Jones with her basket of washing. And there's my naughty little sister just about to say, "Jones." When she got bigger, she started to say other words too. But Mr. and Mrs. Jones still liked it best when she said "Dones" to them. If she was in our garden and they were in their garden, they always talked to her. Even when she could walk and get into mischief, they still liked her. One day, a very funny thing happened. Mrs. Jones was in her kitchen washing a lettuce for Mr. Jones' dinner when she heard a little voice say, "Dones." And there was my naughty little sister standing on Mrs. Jones' back doorstep, and no one was with her. And my little sister was smiling in a very pleased way. The back gate was closed, and the side gate was closed, and the fence was so high that she couldn't have got over it. Mrs. Jones was very pleased to see my sister and gave her a big, big kiss and a jam tart. But she was surprised as well and said, "How did you get here, ducky?" But my little sister still didn't know enough words to tell her about things. She just ate her jam tart. Then she gave Mrs. Jones a big kiss with jam on, but didn't say anything. So Mrs. Jones took my sister back to our house, and Mrs. Jones and Mother wondered and wondered. The very next day, when Mrs. Jones was upstairs making her bed, she heard the little voice downstairs saying, "Dones! Dones!" And there was my sister again. And the back gate was shut, and the side gate was shut, and the fence was still too high to climb over. Mrs. Jones ran straight downstairs and picked my sister up and took her home again. When Mr. Jones came home, Mrs. Jones told him, and Mother told Father, and they all stood in the gardens and talked. And my sister laughed, but she didn't say anything. Then I remembered something that I had found out when I was only as big as my sister was then. Right up by a big bush at the back of our garden was a place in the fence where the wood wasn't nailed anymore. And if you were little enough, you could push the wood to the other side and get through. When I showed them the place, everybody laughed. My sister laughed very loud indeed, and then she went through the hole straight away to show everyone how easy it was. There she is going through the fence. After that, my sister was always going in to see Mrs. Jones, but because the hole was so small and my sister was growing bigger all the time, Mr. Jones found another place in his fence and he made a little gate there. It was a dear little white gate with an easy up and down handle. There was a step up to it and a step down from it. Mr. Jones planted a pink rose to grow over the top of it and made a path from the gate to his garden path, all for my sister, her very own gate. We've heard about that gate before in some other stories. And when Mrs. Jones knocked on our wall at 11 o'clock every morning, my sister went in to have a cup of cocoa with her. She didn't have to go through the hole in the fence anymore. She went through her very own Coco Jones gate. So that is the story of how they got the gate in the garden. And now we also know why they call Mrs. Jones Mrs. Coco Jones. Because every morning at 11 o'clock, Mrs. Coco knocks on her wall and my naughty little sister goes down her garden, through her gate and into Mrs. Coco Jones' house for a cup of cocoa. So there we go. We'll have another story another day. Hope you enjoyed that one. Bye.